The doorbell rang and I took a deep breath before answering. It was finally time to meet Marissa, the woman my son Jake had fallen head over heels for. As I opened the door, a bright smile greeted me. "Hi, you must be Helen," she said warmly. "I'm Marissa." I studied her carefully, taking in her perfectly styled hair and designer outfit. "Nice to meet you, Marissa," I replied, trying to match her enthusiasm. "Please, come in." Jake appeared at my side, beaming with pride as he introduced us. "Mom, this is the woman I've been telling you about." Marissa let out a soft chuckle. "Jake talks about you all the time, Helen. I feel like I already know you." As we settled around the dining table, I couldn't help but notice the subtle tension in Jake's shoulders. He was nervous, desperate for me to approve of his new girlfriend. I decided to keep an open mind, despite the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. "So, Marissa," I began, "what do you do for work?" "I'm in pharmaceutical sales," she replied smoothly. "It keeps me busy, but I love the challenge." I nodded, impressed by her confidence. "That sounds like a demanding career." "It can be," Marissa admitted, "but Jake helps keep me grounded." She reached across the table, taking Jake's hand in hers. The gesture seemed a little too rehearsed, but Jake's face lit up like a child on Christmas morning. As the evening wore on, Marissa's charm offensive continued. She regaled us with stories of her adventures in the corporate world, always managing to make Jake the hero of each tale. I couldn't deny that she was charismatic, but something about her felt off. Perhaps it was the way her eyes seemed to glaze over whenever Jake spoke, or the way she constantly touched her hair, as if checking her appearance. Every move felt calculated, like she was playing a part. Still, I pushed those doubts aside, reminding myself that I was here to support my son. He deserved to be happy, and if Marissa was the one who made him smile, then I would do my best to accept her. As we said our goodbyes, Marissa pulled me into a warm embrace. "Thank you for having me, Helen," she murmured. "I can't wait to get to know you better." I forced a smile, returning the hug. "Likewise, dear." But as I watched them drive away, a knot of unease settled in my stomach. Only time would tell if my instincts about Marissa were right or wrong. The news hit me like a ton of bricks. "You're pregnant?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mix of shock and excitement. Marissa nodded, a smug grin playing on her lips. "That's right, Helen. Jake and I are going to have a baby." I turned to my son, eyes wide with disbelief. "Jake, is this true?" He beamed, wrapping an arm around Marissa's waist. "It's true, Mom. We're going to be parents." In that moment, all my doubts about Marissa melted away. A grandchild, this was the greatest gift I could have asked for. I pulled them both into a fierce hug, tears of joy stinging my eyes. "Oh, my dears, this is wonderful news." As the weeks passed, I threw myself into preparing for the baby's arrival. I scoured every baby store in town, stocking up on essentials and decorating the nursery with care. Marissa, however, seemed less enthused. "Don't you think you're going a bit overboard, Helen?" she remarked one day, eyeing the mountain of stuffed animals with disdain. I brushed off her comment, chalking it up to hormones. "Nonsense, dear. A baby needs all the love and comfort we can give." But as her pregnancy progressed, Marissa's disinterest became harder to ignore. She continued her late nights at the office, often returning home well after midnight. And when she was around, she seemed more preoccupied with her appearance than the life growing inside her. One evening I stopped by their place unannounced and found Marissa on the couch, a half-empty wine glass in hand. "Marissa!" I gasped. "You shouldn't be drinking in your condition." She rolled her eyes, taking another sip. "Relax, Helen. One glass won't hurt the baby." I snatched the glass from her hand, fury bubbling in my chest. "How can you be so cavalier? This child is a precious gift, and you're treating it like an inconvenience." Marissa's eyes narrowed, and for a moment her mask of charm slipped, revealing a cold, calculating woman beneath. "Mind your own business, Helen," she hissed. "This is my body, and I'll do as I please." I recoiled, stunned by the venom in her voice. It was as if a switch had been flipped and the sweet, demure Marissa I'd known was gone, replaced by someone far more sinister. From that day on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. And when little Ethan finally arrived, my worst fears were confirmed. As I held my grandson for the first time, my heart broke at the sight of the angry rash covering his tiny body. Marissa insisted it was nothing, but I knew better. This was no ordinary skin condition. It was a cry for help, a sign that something was deeply amiss. I vowed then and there to protect Ethan, no matter what it took. Because if Marissa wouldn't cherish this precious life, then I would. Ethan's cries pierced the night, jolting me awake. I rushed to Jake and Marissa's house, my heart pounding with dread. When I arrived, Marissa was slumped on the couch, oblivious to our grandson's wails. "Marissa!" I shouted, scooping Ethan into my arms. "Why isn't he being tended to?" She blinked groggily, her eyes glazed. "I was resting. He'll be fine." I fought back tears as I rocked Ethan, his tiny body trembling with distress. His rash had only worsened, angry red splotches covering his delicate skin. "He needs a doctor," I insisted, cradling him close. "This isn't normal." Marissa scoffed, rising unsteadily to her feet. "You're overreacting as usual. It's just a rash." "Just a rash," I echoed incredulously. "Look at him, Marissa. He's in agony." Her eyes narrowed, and she took a step closer, her voice low and menacing. "Back off, Helen. This is my child, not yours." White-hot fury coursed through me, and for a moment I considered striking her, anything to wipe that smug, uncaring look off her face. But Ethan's whimpers brought me back to reality. "You're right," I said, my voice trembling. "He is your child, and you're failing him." With that, I stormed out, Ethan clutched protectively against my chest. At the hospital, the doctors confirmed my worst fears. Ethan was suffering from a severe allergic reaction, likely triggered by something in his environment. As I held his tiny hand, watching him sleep peacefully under the watchful eye of the nurses, a lump formed in my throat. How could any mother neglect her child like this? In the weeks that followed, I became a fixture in Jake and Marissa's home, determined to monitor Ethan's care myself. Marissa bristled at my presence, but I didn't care. My grandson's well-being was all that mattered. One afternoon, as I was changing Ethan's diaper, I noticed a series of angry welts on his back. My blood ran cold. "Marissa!" I bellowed, summoning her to the nursery. "What is the meaning of this?" She sauntered in, her expression bored. "Meaning of what?" I whirled around, holding Ethan up for her to see. "These marks! They look like burns." For a split second, her mask slipped, and I caught a glimpse of something dark and twisted lurking beneath the surface. But just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by her usual air of nonchalance. "Don't be so dramatic, Helen," she drawled. "He probably just scratched himself." I opened my mouth to protest, but the words died on my lips. In that moment, I realized the truth. Marissa was far more dangerous than I'd ever imagined, and if I wasn't careful, she might very well destroy my grandson. The news hit me like a gut punch. Jake had landed a new job, a promotion he'd been chasing for years. But there was a catch. We'd have to leave Ohio and move across the country. "It's an incredible opportunity, Mom," Jake gushed as we packed up their belongings. "A fresh start for our family." I forced a smile, trying to mask my trepidation. "Of course, dear. I'm happy for you." But as I watched Ethan toddle around the near-empty house, my heart ached. At 4 years old, he was still so small, so vulnerable. How could I protect him from Marissa's neglect when they were hundreds of miles away? The day of their departure arrived, and I clung to Ethan, fighting back tears. "You be a good boy, okay?" I whispered, stroking his downy hair. "Grandma loves you so much." Marissa cleared her throat impatiently. "Come on, Helen. We need to get on the road." Reluctantly, I released my grip on Ethan, planting a final kiss on his forehead. As they drove away, a sense of dread settled in the pit of my stomach. Over the next few months, our visits became few and far between. Marissa made every excuse in the book to keep me at arm's length, and Jake, ever the peacekeeper, went along with her wishes. My only solace came from the video calls with Ethan. Those fleeting moments were like a lifeline, allowing me to check in on his well-being, even from afar. But with each passing week, what I saw caused my heart to sink deeper. Ethan grew thinner, his bright eyes dimming with sadness, and the rashes, those angry, inflamed splotches, only seemed to worsen. "Are you taking good care of yourself, sweetheart?" I'd ask gently, studying his pale complexion. He'd nod obediently, but his gaze would flit nervously towards the door, as if fearful of being overheard. One day, as our call was winding down, Ethan leaned in close to the camera, his voice a hushed whisper. "Grandma, I miss you. Mommy's always working, and Daddy's never home. I'm lonely." Those words cut straight through me, unleashing a torrent of guilt and rage. How could Jake and Marissa neglect their own child like this? Didn't they see how much he was suffering? From that day on, I became a woman possessed, scouring the internet for any information that could help me understand what was happening to my grandson. And the more I learned, the sicker I felt. The rashes, the lethargy, the emotional withdrawal, they were all classic signs of abuse and neglect. My sweet Ethan was crying out for help, and I was powerless to reach him. I knew then that I couldn't sit idly by any longer. No matter the cost, I had to find a way to protect Ethan from the monsters who were supposed to be his parents. The frantic call came just after midnight. "Helen!" Jake's panicked voice crackled through the line. "It's Ethan! He can't breathe!" My blood turned to ice in my veins. I was out the door in seconds, speeding towards their house with reckless abandon. By the time I arrived, the paramedics were already there, Ethan's tiny body strapped to a gurney. "What happened?" I demanded, pushing past the EMTs to reach my grandson's side. Jake was a wreck, his face ashen with fear. "We don't know. 1 minute he was fine, the next he was gasping for air." I stroked Ethan's swollen cheek, my heart shattering at the sight of his panicked eyes. "It's okay, baby," I soothed. "Grandma's here." As the ambulance raced towards the hospital, I clutched Ethan's hand, silently willing him to hang on. Marissa sat motionless in the corner, her expression unreadable. At the emergency room, a flurry of doctors and nurses descended upon us. Ethan was whisked away, leaving Jake and I to pace the waiting area, gripped by agonizing dread. Hours ticked by before a doctor finally emerged, his brow furrowed with concern. "Mr. and Mrs. Taylor, your son suffered a severe allergic reaction. Luckily, you got him here in time." Relief washed over me, quickly replaced by a burning rage. I rounded on Marissa, my voice trembling with fury. "You did this! Your neglect nearly killed him." She recoiled, a flash of fear flickering across her features. "I didn't. I would never." "Save it," I spat. "I've seen how you treat that poor boy. The rashes, the bruises. It's been going on for months." Jake's eyes went wide, his gaze darting between us in bewilderment. "Mom, what are you talking about?" I whirled on him, my heart breaking at his naivete. "Open your eyes, Jake. Can't you see what's been happening right under your nose?" Marissa seized the moment, plastering on her best innocent expression. "Helen, you're overreacting. I love Ethan with all my heart. This was just a terrible accident." But her words rang hollow. I'd seen the truth, the cold, calculating monster that lurked beneath her pretty facade. And in that moment, I knew I had to protect my grandson, no matter the cost. "You're right, Marissa," I said, my voice low and deadly calm. "This ends now." With that, I turned on my heel and marched back to Ethan's room, leaving Jake to grapple with the reality of his wife's cruelty. As I took my place at my grandson's bedside, I silently vowed that Marissa would never lay a finger on him again. The battle lines had been drawn, and this time I would do whatever it took to win. In the days following Ethan's hospitalization, I became a woman possessed. While he recovered under my watchful eye, I scoured every corner of Jake and Marissa's home, desperate for answers. What I uncovered chilled me to the bone. Hidden in the back of Marissa's closet was a veritable pharmacy of prescription medications, pills, inhalers, ointments galore. Each one prescribed to a different alias, a twisted web of lies and deception. My hands trembled as I rifled through the stash, my mind reeling. Could Marissa be the one poisoning our grandson, inducing those horrific allergic reactions? The thought was almost too terrible to bear. But as the pieces began to fall into place, a sickening realization took hold. Marissa's neglect ran far deeper than I'd imagined. She was deliberately tormenting Ethan, using his frail body as a weapon to control Jake. With each crisis, each trip to the hospital, she tightened her grip, playing the doting mother while secretly orchestrating her son's suffering. White-hot rage coursed through my veins. How could anyone be so heartless, so utterly devoid of human decency? I knew then that I had to act, had to find a way to pry Jake free from Marissa's clutches before it was too late. But confronting her head-on would only lead to more lies, more manipulation. No, I needed proof. Irrefutable evidence that would shatter her carefully constructed facade and expose the monster lurking beneath. With trembling hands, I began documenting everything: photographs of the pill stashes, detailed logs of Ethan's symptoms and hospitalizations. I even managed to swipe a few strands of Marissa's hair, determined to have it tested for traces of the drugs. All the while, I played the part of the doting grandmother, lulling Marissa into a false sense of security. She had no idea of the storm brewing, the walls closing in around her twisted web of deceit. Then, one fateful evening, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. I was tucking Ethan into bed when he clutched my arm, his eyes wide with fear. "Grandma," he whispered, "I heard Mommy on the phone. She was talking about getting rid of me." A chill ran down my spine as realization washed over me. Marissa's cruelty knew no bounds. She was willing to go to any lengths to maintain her hold over Jake, even if it meant eliminating the one person standing in her way. In that moment, my path became clear. I would stop at nothing to protect my grandson, to tear him from the clutches of that vile, evil woman. The game was up. It was time for Marissa to face the consequences of her actions, to answer for the suffering she'd inflicted on an innocent child. Steeling myself, I began laying the trap, gathering every shred of evidence, every damning piece of proof, and when the time was right, I would unleash it all, shattering her world into a million pieces. Marissa's reign of terror was about to come to a brutal, decisive end. Justice would be served, no matter the cost. The air was thick with tension as Jake and Marissa arrived at my house that fateful evening. I could see the confusion etched on my son's face, the dawning realization that something was terribly amiss. "Mom, what's going on?" he asked warily as they stepped inside. "Your message sounded urgent." I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the confrontation to come. "Please, have a seat. There's something you both need to see." Marissa's eyes narrowed, but she obediently sank onto the couch, her posture rigid with barely contained hostility. Jake, ever the peacekeeper, sat beside her, his brow furrowed with concern. Without a word, I hit play on the video compilation I'd painstakingly assembled, a damning collection of footage documenting Marissa's neglect and cruelty toward Ethan. There she was, swigging wine straight from the bottle, her pregnant belly swollen with our grandson. Another clip showed her viciously berating a cowering Ethan, her words laced with venom. Jake's face drained of color as the evidence played out before him, each clip more horrifying than the last. Marissa, however, remained eerily calm, her expression one of detached indifference. As the final video ended, a deafening silence hung in the air. Jake was the first to break it, his voice trembling with a potent mix of fury and heartbreak. "Marissa, how could you?" She simply shrugged, her cold eyes meeting his gaze. "He was a burden, Jake, a constant drain on our lives. You were too blinded by sentiment to see it." My blood boiled at her callous words, at the utter lack of remorse she displayed. This was no longer a woman scorned. This was a soulless monster, devoid of even the most basic human decency. Before I could react, Jake was on his feet, his fists clenched at his sides. "You evil, twisted bitch! How dare you lay a hand on our son!" Marissa sneered, rising to meet his challenge. "Your son? Please, Jake. We both know you were never cut out to be a father." Her words seemed to flip a switch in my son. With a feral roar, he lunged at her, his hands closing around her throat. "Jake, no!" I cried, rushing to intervene. But Marissa was quicker, her knee connecting with his groin in a sickening blow. As Jake crumpled to the floor, she turned her sights on me, her eyes blazing with unholy fury. "This is all you're doing, you meddlesome old hag!" Before I could react, her fist connected with my jaw, sending me reeling backwards. I tasted blood as stars danced before my eyes, but I refused to back down. Summoning every ounce of my strength, I charged at her, tackling her to the ground. We grappled fiercely, trading blows and curses like feral animals. Through the haze of violence, I caught a glimpse of Jake staggering to his feet, his face etched with grim determination. In his hands, he gripped an antique vase, a family heirloom, heavy and solid. Our eyes met, and in that moment, an unspoken understanding passed between us. This had to end, once and for all. With a primal roar, Jake brought the vase crashing down on Marissa's skull, the sickening crunch of shattering ceramic filling the air. She crumpled lifelessly to the floor, finally vanquished. As the dust settled, Jake and I clung to each other, our bodies racked with heaving sobs. It was over. Marissa's reign of terror had finally come to an end. But even as relief washed over me, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd crossed a line from which there was no return. Our hands were stained with blood, our souls forever tarnished by the darkness we'd unleashed. Yet as I looked into Jake's haunted eyes, I knew we'd do it all again in a heartbeat. For Ethan's sake, no price was too high to pay. Justice had been served, but at what cost? Only time would tell if the nightmare was truly over, or if this was merely the first act in a tragedy that would continue to unfold. The aftermath of that fateful night was a blur of flashing lights and stern-faced officers. As the police swarmed my home, carting Marissa's lifeless body away, a heavy silence descended. Jake sat slumped on the couch, his hands still trembling from the violence that had transpired. I moved to comfort him, but the words caught in my throat. What could I possibly say to ease the guilt, the anguish we both felt? In the end, it was the soft whimper of a familiar voice that broke the spell. "Grandma? Daddy?" Ethan stood in the doorway, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. In that moment, everything became crystal clear. This, all of this, had been for him. I crossed the room in 2 strides, scooping my grandson into my arms and cradling him close. "It's all right, sweetheart," I murmured, planting a kiss on his downy head. "The nightmare is over." The officers moved in then, gently but firmly separating us for questioning. Jake was led away, his shoulders sagging with the weight of his actions. As for me, I answered each query with brutal honesty, laying bare every sordid detail of Marissa's depravity. By the time the sun peeked over the horizon, the gravity of what we'd done had fully settled in. Marissa was gone, her evil purged from our lives, but the cost had been immense, the scars left behind deeper than any of us could fathom. In the days that followed, the legal system ground into motion. Marissa's past came to light, a twisted tapestry of lies and manipulation that stretched back years. With each revelation, the weight on our shoulders grew heavier, the guilt more suffocating. Had we gone too far? Crossed a line from which there was no return? Those doubts plagued me, haunting my every waking moment. But then I'd look at Ethan, my sweet, precious grandson, and I knew I'd do it all again in a heartbeat. His safety, his well-being was all that mattered. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the hammer fell. Marissa's actions, even in death, had sealed her fate. The evidence was damning, the charges severe. As for Jake and I, our sentences were far more complicated. The courts showed leniency, recognizing the extenuating circumstances that had driven us to such extremes. But we were not absolved. The price for our actions would be steep, our penance harsh. Yet as I stood before the stern-faced judge, awaiting my fate, I couldn't find it in me to feel remorse. Not truly. Because when all was said and done, Ethan was safe. He was free from the monster that had tormented him, the shadow that had nearly snuffed out his young life. In that moment, I knew that no matter what price I had to pay, it would be worth it 1,000 times over. The road ahead would be long and arduous, but we would walk it together, Jake, Ethan, and I. A family, battered and bruised, but finally whole. As the gavel fell and the courtroom cleared, I pulled my grandson close, planting a tender kiss on his brow. "It's going to be all right, my love," I whispered fiercely. "Grandma's got you now, and nothing will ever harm you again."